All right, so the quadratic formula. It is a very handy and helpful formula, but it also is dangerous. There's lots of places where people make careless mistakes when they're using the quadratic formula. So it is great to have. I've got a little sign over there next to the green studentisms one that says emergency use only. So I would really recommend only using the quadratic formula. If you can't do star and you can't do split, nothing else works. Use it as a last resort. Okay? So let's just review what the quadratic formula is. All right. So when a formula is in order, ax squared plus bx plus c, and it's equal to 0, so it has to both be in order and equal to 0. It also has to start with a square. It is not called the cubic formula. It doesn't work. There is a cubic formula, but the quadratic formula only works on quadratic equations, which are these that have squares in them. So you can Google what is the cubic formula, and what is the quartic formula, and what is the quintic formula, and they get progressively more complex. We're just going to do quadratic. So when that is true, then x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So you know the little song? X equals negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right, that is your quadratic formula. All right, so we've got this going on. So let's say you've got the x squared plus a 3 equals 10x. So it's not in the right order, so we got to take care of that first and make sure it's equal to 0. So I'm going to move the 10x to the other side. So x squared minus 10x plus 3, and now it's equal to 0 and in the right order. So what is the 3 the value for? C. What about the negative 10? And then what about A?
1.
It is. There's an understood that there is a 1 there. Now, you should probably have at least thought about whether or not the quadratic form or the star would have worked on this one. So you've got a 3 and a negative 10. And there's nothing that works for 3 and negative 10, which is why we need the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b in this case is negative parentheses negative 10. That's negative b, which is already a negative number, plus or minus the square root of parentheses negative 10 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, and c, which is 3. And that's going to all be over 2a, which is 2 times 1. Most people usually start out right, and then they're going to make mistakes when they are simplifying. So the first mistake is not to change the double negative to positive. That happens a lot, so that's one thing to watch out for. The second thing to watch out for is the square. A lot of times, especially when there's a negative involved, people will tell me that the answer is negative 100. When you're squaring a negative number, it's negative 10 times another negative 10. So there's always 2 negatives when you're squaring something. So it's never negative 100. It's always going to be a positive number. So make sure that that's one pitfall that people will have. Then minus 12, which is 4 times 3, and it's all over the number 2. When we simplify, we'll get 10 plus or minus the square root of how much? 88. All over 2. Now that should be simplified. 88 is not a perfect square. The closest perfect square to 88 is 81. But 88 does have partial square roots in it that are perfect squares. And so you'd want to simplify 88 into the square root of 4 and the square root of 22. So 4 times 22 is 88. That would simplify into 10 plus or minus 2 with a rad 22 all over 2. And then the final most common mistake is in reducing. Reducing is the last thing, but it's a common error for students to just reduce partially. They reduce just that, and they ignore that the 10 has to be reduced also. So I don't recommend reducing until you've broken it up. So what I'm going to suggest that you do instead is you separate. That 10 gets its own 2, and 2 rad 22 also gets its own 2. That way you're more likely to reduce correctly instead of incorrectly if you break it up. Okay, so it's the breakup, and then you reduce. So once you've broken it up, then for sure go ahead and reduce here, and then we'll have 10 reduced to 2 is 5 plus or minus the square root of 22. Yeah. Do you have to? If you can remember how to reduce it correctly without breaking it up, fine. But sometimes that is a common mistake. So if you want to skip from this step down to here, that's fine without showing it as long as you're confident in yourself. Okay? Just don't kick yourself later and go, oh shoot, I shouldn't have made that mistake. Okay, last question. Square root 5 x minus 1 equals negative 4x squared. Well, first of all, it's not in the right order. So the easiest way for me to do that is to take care of the negative 4x squared. So I'm going to add 4x squared to both sides. So that's going to go in the front, 4x squared, plus square root 5x minus 1, and now it's in the right order. So the 4 is the a value, the rad 5 is the b value, and the negative 1 is the c value. It's okay to have a, b, and c values that are, less than pretty. Rad 5 isn't necessarily the nicest looking number, but it still will work. All right, what we're going to have is then x equals negative b, that'll be negative parentheses square root 5, plus or minus the square root of parentheses square root 5 squared, minus 4 times a, which is also 4, times c, which is negative 1. And that's all going to be over 2a, which is 2 times 4. Now comes the process of cleaning that up. At the beginning, when we have negative rad 5, we're just going to leave it, negative rad 5. And then under the square root, we have a square that's around the parentheses of rad 5, which means rad 5 times itself, rad 5. What does that give you? Just 5. So we've got just 5, and then we have minus 4 times negative 1, which is ending up to be a plus or a minus. Okay, it's a positive. Positive how much? 16. And that's all going to be over the number 8. So we're going to have negative rad 5 plus or minus the square root of 21 all over the number 8. Now can I add the rad 5 to the rad 21 and get what? If I add them, would I get positive? Would I get 26? If I subtracted them, do I still get 26? If I add them, I don't get 26. If I add them, okay, there's no adding of radicals. You can't add radicals together. All right? So sort of trick question. You cannot add 2 radicals together. Doesn't work. Okay? Now, some people are like, oh yeah, I could add them together and I could get rad 16, because negative 5 and 21 make 16, and rad 16 is 4, and it's all over 8, and so yeah, the answer is 1/2. Woohoo! Okay? Oops. I know. Well, let's try that again. All right, unfortunately, it's totally fake math. Okay? Not fake math. You got to know the difference between real math and fake math. That is not it. All right, you get to stop. You can't add radicals. There's nothing else you can do. You can't make the 21 any smaller. I can't add it to the rad 5. I can't simplify. I can't reduce. So that is your final answer. So don't try and do more by doing fake math. Stop if there's no more real math to do.